Thank you all for coming here, and thank you all especially for coming to hear a lecture on a subject as boring as theology. Because what, after all, could be more boring than theology? Does anyone even think about it anymore? Well, somebody must. There's still books being published about it, in addition to mine. But it is a kind of dead subject. Oh, by the way, did you know that there's a serious movement to have theology cast out of many universities as no longer being really an academic discipline? This is a bit awkward for many places like, for example, Harvard, the oldest university in the United States, which was started to teach theology, as was Yale and blah, 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 Princeton, blah, blah, blah. But it has become so irrelevant to so many people that there are movements to kick it out. I doubt they will, but that's the state that theology has reached at this point. So theology would seem to be extremely irrelevant, and most people might well say that they're not interested in it. Well, my view is different. My view is that theology is not optional. You will have a theology whether you want one or not. Because even to believe in nothing is to have a certain set of beliefs about God and the world. So it might not be a bad idea to know what those are consciously. If you believe, for example, that God will punish you with hell if you're bad, as certain people do, you're going to have a very different attitude toward the world and quite possibly a different behavior than if you believe there's nothing after death and it's pretty much, grab all the toys you can and die with as much clenched in your greedy fists as is possible. And we both know that there are many types of individuals who live according to both sets of rules. But somehow this is not an entirely satisfactory state of affairs. And the fault of this has to do with the foundational religion of our civilization, which is Christianity. And the theology of the Christian church is, when you look at it closely, plainly, and without a lot of rhetoric, just ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Let me explain it to you. It would seem that 6,000 years ago, God got mad at the human race because a couple of people ate a piece of fruit in Armenia. God got so mad that he condemned these people and all of their descendants to eternal damnation. But since he's an all-loving God, he kind of felt bad about this. And he thought, well, maybe I can do something. So he sent a part of it down to earth, had it tortured to death, and somehow this made it all right. Except not really, because if you don't believe this story, you're going to go to hell anyway. Now, put this way, it makes people squirm. You can certainly dolly it up in all sorts of dogmas and rituals and doxologies, some of which are very powerful and very eloquent. But when you get right down to it, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Particularly, of course, because this God is supposed to be a lot more loving than any of us could possibly be. And probably even the cruelest person would not want to sentence someone to eternal suffering. After all, even if you enjoy tormenting people, the fun is over after a little while. So, what are we going to do with this? How did this happen? Well, it's fairly clear how it all happened, in that these ideas evolved over a very, very long time. And there's a history of dogmatics, as it's called, in the theological departments that are still being permitted to survive, that explain how this all goes. And you can see where a given belief began and why it arose. There are volumes and volumes of this. And fortunately, there are so many volumes that I don't need to go into this here. But let me at least go into one aspect of it. There's this whole notion of sacrifice. And the idea that Jesus came down to earth and was sacrificed for our sins. This is considered a core belief among the vast majority of Christians and Christian denominations. Well, does this make any sense? No, not really. Not to us today, but it did in the context of its time. Because in the time of Christ, religion practically was animal sacrifice. Those of you who know the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, they're always like sacrificing animals here and there, pretty much on every page. You know, Pythagoras, the philosopher, was supposed to be a vegetarian who was opposed to animal sacrifice, but apparently it's also the case that he sacrificed a hecatomb, which is 100 oxen, to celebrate the discovery of the Pythagorean theorem. So this was widespread. Now, you'll all have heard of the Jewish temple and the temple in Jerusalem and how beautiful it was, and many people have a delightful Sunday school picture of it. And Josephus, a historian who actually saw it, lived at its time, said that it gleamed like a snow-capped mountain in the distance. It was so white. Well, that's all very well and good, and it was true. But it had another feature that made itself of interest to another first-hand describer. And he was very, very impressed at the plumbing system it had. It had to have an elaborate and intricate plumbing system to drain all the blood off. Because if you're sacrificing, cows and sheep pretty much all day long, you got to do something with the blood. I mean, all I can think is like, what must it have smelled like? You've got this kind of roasting meat smell and then this kind of animal smell, and the blood has its own smell. They probably tried to cover it with lots of incense and whatnot. Nonetheless, this kind of illustrates just how vital animal sacrifice was. And they would, if a person from that era came here and watched us, he would probably conclude that we were atheists, because I don't see them worshiping any gods. They're not sacrificing any animals. So that was the context in which Christ's death and, it is said, resurrection became to be seen as a sacrifice. It was almost impossible in those days for anyone to see it otherwise. That's totally natural, totally forgivable, and totally understandable. But where does it leave us today? You don't believe in animal sacrifice. What possible, here I am slaughtering this cow. What does it have to do with the fact that I did something bad and I want to make it up to God? It doesn't fit in our mindsets anymore. And the theology of Christianity is still kind of built on this. And we can see where it came from just from the little I've told you. Doesn't make any sense either. So you're in kind of a problem here, because you're supposed to believe in this. You don't, there's a joke in which a kid says, faith is believing what you know ain't so. And that has to do with a lot of this belief in something that we can no longer believe in. And some, the more conservatives, say, well, you have to believe this anyway. And the more liberal Christians don't really believe it themselves. Even the clergy don't believe it themselves, but they don't really have anything else. And sometimes the answers come out in hems and haws if you poke them a little too much. So where are we to go with this? For example, I just made fun of the whole Genesis myth, but it might even actually make sense viewed in a somewhat more existential context. Let me tell you this story. This man and this woman came to God one day and said, "Hey, God, we heard about this thing called good and evil, and we'd like to know what it is." And God said, that is really not a very good idea. I do not suggest that you do this. And they said, "Oh, come on, we want to." He said, "All right, you got your wish, but you're going to have to go and live in a realm where you have to work hard for a living and it hurts to have babies." Now, what have I just done? I've just told you the story of Genesis in a way that I think is more existentially plausible. Because you're living in a world in which you have to work hard for a living, except a few of us. And as every woman has ever told me who's had the experience, it hurts to have babies. So that is the world we live in. We wanted to know, the human race collectively wanted to know good and evil. And this is what we got. And I can make an infallible statement about everyone here, everyone who's watching this, everyone who will watch it on YouTube, how many months from now, you have known some good and some evil in your life. I would be very interested to hear what someone might stand up and object to on that. But that's just the case. That is the human condition. We are so accustomed to thinking of life in terms of a mixture of good and evil that it is difficult to imagine a world that's desirable without evil. Think about it. Has anyone ever said, or have you ever thought yourself, heaven sounds kind of boring. You know, you're kind of up there with the clouds and the harp and the singing all the time. Or, you know, take another more hedonic version and, you know, it's like this nice garden with lots of fruit and lions and tigers to pet and all sorts of things. All of those actually sound kind of dull. Now, is heaven, if such a thing exists, really like that? I don't think so. But it does seem to me quite clear that we are very, very almost unable to imagine a world that's at all desirable or interesting without evil. That is how deeply rooted it is into our minds. So some people say the world is basically a good place. Well, no, it really isn't. Or it's really an evil place. No, it really isn't. It's a mixture of good and evil. Say from a point of view, well, if you want to know what evil is, you're going to have to experience some of it. But if a world were completely evil, it would be cut off from God completely and therefore could not exist. So, a mixture of good and evil. I was reading a book recently on the symbolism of masonry, and I'm not a mason myself, but as I understand it, there's the floor of a Masonic lodge, or of the lodge room, is basically a black and white checkerboard. And that's to reflect this exact fact. This is a mixture of good and evil, of light and dark, whatever you want to call it. And this is the human condition. And to many people, this seems pointless and unjust, partly because who gets to experience how much good and evil varies wildly, and it doesn't really seem to come across all that clearly in terms of what you deserve and what you didn't, which, you know, if I'll be frank here in the context of these hallowed halls and say that presents certain problems for the idea of karma, even if karma does apply in most cases. That's another talk, however. So there is, oh, by the way, what if everything was completely just? What if the law of karma was completely 100% accurate? There would be no evil because everybody got exactly what they deserved. So think about that for a while. You can go into this, and you get all sorts of debates about this, but this concept of a world where there is good, there is evil, there is justice and injustice is very, very deeply rooted in our experience. And as I say, it's hard to conceive of things without it. So that's kind of where we are. So how does this all tie into the notions of the fall? There is this idea that, you know, particularly in esoteric thought, that the human race, collectively, you know, the divine man who's really a man-woman, the divine androgyne, the Kabbalists call it Adam, Kadmon. There are, you know, many different names for it. Practically every tradition has its own name for it. In the Christian tradition, it's called Adam, which is Adam and Eve, because after all, Adam and Eve were male and female. as we learn from the first chapter of Genesis. So this cosmic man and woman had a fall, and it's into this. Now, here's another question, which I am not going to answer tonight. Some say that this was a horrible mistake, that somebody just did something terribly, terribly wrong at a level beyond any big bangs or beyond any quantum theories or subparticles or whatever you want. Somebody made a big mistake, and this is how we find ourselves in this world. That is one view. The other view is that this is all what the theologians call a felix culpa, a happy fault. That is to say, it was kind of a necessary thing for humanity to do, to live in this world of materiality and ascend up with the knowledge gained on this plane. I personally would be very, very cautious about jumping to either of these two conclusions. My own view is that it can look either way depending on what angle you're taking. So it's a good idea to maybe keep both of them in mind and not rush to too many judgments about which it is or what. It's possible, and I think even a good idea to speculate about it. But it becomes quite another matter if you seize on one speculation as the answer and then go around trying to stuff it in everybody else's throat. I think that's, the first part is legitimate. The second part becomes very, very questionable, and the history of the last 2,000 years shows us quite well where it can lead. So there's this notion of the fall. Now, I'm going to turn to the only Christian theology that really makes any logical sense of all of the ones that I've been exposed to. And it has to do, as you've already probably figured out, has to do with A Course in Miracles. Could you raise your hand? How many of you are familiar with A Course in Miracles in some way? So, a lot of you. Yeah, okay. But I will sum it up. A Course in Miracles is a channeled text. And that means that it was dictated by a voice inside a woman's head, and she wrote it down verbatim as she heard it. It has been edited since then, and that's a long story too, which, again, I'm certainly not going to get into here. And this was eventually edited and published. The woman was named Helen Schuchman. She was a psychologist in New York. She was kind of an atheist. She kind of confided in a friend of hers named Bill Thetford. They were in the psychology department at the Columbia School of Medicine or something like that. So, these were highly functional people. And they were, carrying out highly difficult jobs. So, these are not basket cases. But nonetheless, she said, I'm hearing this voice in my head, and I don't know, it says to write it down. He says what her friend Bill Thetford said, well, why don't you write it down? And I'll help you transcribe the notes. And he did. And this started in 1965, and took several years to do all that. It wasn't published until 1975 as A Course in Miracles. The original edition, which some of you, I'm sure, have seen, is in 3 blue volumes. More recent editions are in 1 blue, or there are lots of different editions now, volume. So it ostensibly was channeled by Jesus Christ himself, so it said, which is a bit disarming. And Helen Schuchman, who's, a Jewish woman who kind of mostly atheistic, kind of flirted with Catholicism a few times in her life, this becomes rather odd. She obviously found it rather disconcerting. And she said herself, and this is my view is exactly the same as hers, and I quoted in that book, I don't really know if this is Jesus or not. But this voice had a certain power and authority that compelled me to write it down, and I did so. And I think it does. Whether it actually came from Jesus Christ is impossible to verify, because you can't go by the teaching of the churches. These were all invented often centuries later. You can't even go by the Gospels in the New Testament or not in the New Testament, because scholars, the most learned, reputable, best educated, most authoritative scholars do not agree what in those Gospels actually goes back to Jesus and what was put in his mouth afterward. This is not just like people jabber. These are the leading authorities in universities who know these texts in the original languages in and out. So there's no criteria for judging that. So it has to be taken on its own terms. And I would say that taken on its own terms is a very powerful spiritual method. Some of you who are familiar with it know that it comes in three parts. A text, which is kind of the theory part, a workbook, which is 365 daily lessons, and a teacher's manual, which explains some of the more common concepts and deals with some questions. If you want to talk about working with a course, we'll kind of get there. I'm going to focus on the theoretical side tonight because that is theology. And I think that's an area that needs to be highlighted more because our society, our civilization is suffering from a lack of a theology that anyone can take very seriously, more acutely perhaps than we like to realize. It may also be the case that many of the things that we're upset about, that are the problems we're facing, are caused by this lack of a theology. So this is one possibility. Anyway, Course in Miracles says, God did not create this world. Because, why? Because God is all good. And this world, we've already determined from our own minute-by-minute experience, is not all good. It's a mixture of good and evil. So how did this world come about? Well, the human race, us, oh, by the way, this human race that I've been talking about has a name in A Course in Miracles. It's called the Son of God. So is Jesus the Son of God? Oh, yes, along with you. That's practically a quote from the Course. So it's all of us. All of us made this decision. A course calls it a tiny mad idea that you could live without God. I told it in kind of a funny way when explaining about Adam and Eve, but of course doesn't really put it that way. It was a descent into fear. Because if you're cut off from God, suddenly it's paralyzingly fearful. So fearful that it threw the Son of God into a coma. And we are not talking about a coma like somebody in the hospital has who's on life support. This is a coma that gave rise to the world that we know. The Course calls it the circle of fear. And what is this? Well, you've experienced it yourself. You got your daily life and, you're happy about this part of your life. You're unhappy about that part. You think this part of things are great. This part of things is awful. But very often, you just there's the sense of just raw fear. Of course, we reify it. What's your fear? Well, I might not have any money when I'm old. I might get sick or something. But those are just merely excuses for the fear. It's this kind of baseline fear that gives rise to everything that we all live out of. And it was this cosmic shock that generated the world we know. Now, here's an interesting thing. Well, some of you have heard about Gnosticism, in which posited, as far as we know, because what they actually taught back then is rather vague. The Gnostics lived in the early years of the Christian centuries, that the world was created by an inferior second-rate god called the demiurge, from a Greek word meaning craftsman. And A Course is very similar to that, but it's not like there's some funny second-rate god up there who's standing up and, making noise and making this world, which the Gnostic texts sometimes make it sound like, and which many of the Gnostic interpreters thought what we were saying. This demiurge is what I call the world generator. This world generator is the cognitive apparatus in our minds that leads us to perceive the world as it is. This is the basic way that we structure reality. And this necessarily includes good and evil, with all the trappings. So out of this lack of consciousness, which Course calls, it doesn't use the word fall very often, except maybe once or twice. It calls it the separation. That is, the separation, this apparent separation between the Son and the Father. Now, this wasn't the idea of God. I'm using these Christian terms, they're male terms, Father, Son, all of this, because that is what the Course does. And the Course uses it because as a way of, shall we say, deconstructing Christian theology, saying what maybe it was maybe what Jesus really was trying to say. So using another set of terms, you could phrase this in terms of many different traditions, but it uses these Christian terms specifically, and because I'm talking in a context of Christian theology, those are the terms I'm going to use. A lot of women have problems with the gender thing. I understand that. And you can make whatever adjustments you want or go study something else, but I'm going to just use the terms as they're used here. So the Son fell and broke into lots of little pieces. And these pieces are every one of us mistakenly viewing ourselves as separate individuals. The uniting, what? All right, how many times you've heard it? You heard it over and over again. We are all one. Yeah, well, what the hell does that mean? Right? Really, what does that mean? Are we all one? No, we're not one. You got the job, I didn't. I got the girl, you didn't. No, we're not one. What the hell is all that about? Well, in this world, yeah, that's the way it seems. That's the way our cognitive structure has set it up. That is not the world that God created. And getting from one step to the other is what spiritual disciplines are about. And this idea is of this kind of shattered human appears in any number of places, where in Zoroastrian myth, the cosmic man, Gaia Mart, like dissolves into different metals. In fact, I think James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, which is certainly one of the most cryptic books ever written, is about that. And Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan is a character in an Irish folk song that wakes up when he smells whiskey at his own funeral. It's actually, you can listen to it. It's kind of a funny song. Irish bands do it all the time. Finnegan, Finn is an end again, and wake again, this constant cycle of waking and sleeping. But I think you could argue that what is happening in this is that Finnegan falls asleep and he dreams he's these various characters. Because the whole thing is very dreamlike, and the language is very dreamlike. One thing is every dream you've ever had, something is that, but something is not. I was in Rio de Janeiro, but Rio de Janeiro, in my dream, they had igloos and something like that. That dreams are like that. So of course, what the Course is telling us is this is all a dream. It's another species of dream than the ones we have. But it's quite clear that the mind can make up a world for itself, as you know, when you dream every night. I had some funny dream last night in which I borrowed my grandmother's car for too long, and I needed to get back to her, and I was going to get a car of my own. And this was a big problem, I was really kind of worried and upset about it. And then I woke up and I was like, that had nothing to do with anything. My grandmother died over 30 years ago. But, it seems real at the time. Dreams seem real, but where are they? They're constructed somewhere in the structure of your mind. So And this is a fact we have to, shall we say, live with. Now, nobody likes this because it requires you, at the very least, not to take the world you see very seriously. And this is one of the most impossible things, or almost impossible things you can ask of anyone. Because everything is calling out you to take it seriously. Everything from the horrible news today about the horrible goings on here, there, and everywhere, the gas bill, your irate in-laws, the lawn that needs mowing, the leaky roof, all of these things are just calling out for your attention. And if you'll notice, they kind of insist upon it's their reality. So the Course is saying that this is not real in one sense. Now, this is a great source of difficulty because you can stumble over yourself thinking about the word real. And it's very difficult, particularly in English, because in English, the word real has to do with things. It comes from the Latin res, which means thing. And that's why real estate is called that. Real estate is thing. It's a house, it's a piece of land you can touch, it's there. So that is what we think of as reality. What many spiritual traditions, including the Course, would say is that this is not reality, this is not real in an ultimate sense. It has no innate substance. It passes and goes. That's essentially what the Buddhists are saying. So this gets really disorienting because if it isn't this, what is there? And then you hit into something that it's a little hard to take. Remember the circle of fear? If you start thinking along these lines, you kind of realize, we all know things are not really what they appear, right? Science has proved this. Science is in a big crisis now because they've shown that our grasp of reality, our cognition of reality, is a result of our neural mental states, or cognitive states. And then it's going around saying, well, hey, on the other hand, what these cognitive states are telling us is really the case. You can't both say that this is kind of an elaborate construct of your mind and say that this is really the way things are. But that's what science is trying to do. And science, at least in that respect, is the scientific worldview is collapsing, and that probably a much bigger crisis than many of the other things you may or may not be concerned about. But again, that's another lecture. We're here. You hit into this bandwidth of fear, a circle of fear. It has other names. And it can be viewed in other ways. Like, for example, a very famous 14th century English mystical text calls it the cloud of unknowing. That's what it calls it. That's the title of the book if you want to go read it. Some of you, I'm sure, have. And it says, you have to strike it at this cloud of unknowing through a meditative practice. That is, you hit this thing and you have to kind of go through it. Course in Miracles simply, and it does have these exercises in which, you're going to see yourself kind of going through clouds. And go on, clouds can't hurt you. Because all of this fear is illusory. Nonetheless, it can be a bit of a shock to kind of tap into it right away. And for those of you who are connoisseurs of the Western esoteric tradition, Western mystical tradition, this is sometimes called confronting the dweller on the threshold. What is that? Well, just what I said. At some point, you're going to come fast, at first it'll kind of look like all your fears put together, but then it's just fear. Just plain, blank fear. And it is very hard to kind of keep your attention going through that. It's a long, long process. Yeah, you can have a moment of enlightenment, and that is entirely possible. maybe not entirely brilliant to try to count on it. But in any case, it has to be moved through to get through to reality. And there's so many traditions, so many philosophies that make this point in so many different ways. The most famous passage in all of Western philosophy is Plato's myth of the cave. These people are chained in a cave. Their chains are head forward. They can only see shadows that are projected on a wall by things behind them. Finally, somebody picks up one of these guys and, takes him outside and shows him what life is really like. And, he's amazed. And then he sort of says, he kind of wants to go down and tell everybody else in the cave about this. And of course he does, and they don't really believe him because it sounds ridiculous. And again, that is a metaphor of many, spiritual messages, of many teachings, the sense of cloud, darkness that you have to go through. If you look at the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, there's an enormous amount of imagery in which God is surrounded in cloud and darkness. There's a verse in Job, they do not see the light of illumination that is in the clouds. If you go through and look at clouds in the Old Testament, God is constantly seen this way. I mean, it's a central part of the almost iconography of the Hebrew Bible. So what is the way to get through these clouds? Well, of course, Miracles has its own method, which is this 365 lesson workbook, and by the way, I think, some of you obviously have some experience with it. If you don't have any experience with it, I guess I would say, I would probably leave the text aside at the beginning and just start with the lessons, the workbook lessons, because they're at least they start out simple. And if you do them for a few months, then you can start reading the text and it will be a lot easier. It's a discipline, to do it. If you follow the directions, it's one lesson a day for 365 days a year. Parts of it are easy, parts of it are not so easy. People find different parts of it hard and easy and so on. But it is powerful. And I think, at the very least, if you actually go through it in a disciplined way, in a serious way, it will at least loosen the hold. You might not end up being completely awakened, but it will at least shake all the stuff loose a little bit. And if the awakening were sudden, again, you might just go back into fear again and just forget it all again. So it is one way of doing it. There are many other ways of at least coming to some understanding of this. One central lesson of the course is forgiveness as the way out of all this. And why would that be the case? Well, if none of this has any inherent reality, if all of this is just, some enormous video game, then you can't take it too seriously, no matter how ultimate it all may seem. Even the body, the physical body, is only the result of our, shall we say, experience of this. The body itself has no innate reality. If you believe in the resurrection of Christ, some of you do, some of you may not. Personally, I wasn't there, so I'm not going to make any definitive statements, but the body vanished. And the Course says, the body vanished because I realized it was nothing. And that is very powerful and very difficult. But, my sons are 10 and 11 are nursing their video game addictions very nicely. And they're always playing video games and, my wife is up there. Come on, it's time for you to bed. Okay, Mom, just as soon as I die. You know, and it's, the thing is, the idea of the Course and all these other things is that even our physical death is is no more serious than that, no matter how we try to believe it is. Why do we believe it is? Well, we certainly identify with our bodies. The idea that you are not your body is a shock to many people. It's not a great thing to identify with because, you know, particularly, well, you might look pretty good at age 18, but, you know, 30 or 40 years later, not looking so good. And you're starting to look at it like a point where somebody's going to, you know, put you under the ground or into a crematory oven. And actually, there's a lot of iconography in even the conventional Christian tradition about this. One of the most striking things I've ever seen is in Bristol Cathedral in England. And if you go into these cathedrals, they all have these sepulchres, you know, these tombs. Usually they often have effigies of the bishop or nobleman carved on top. And most of the times the bishop or nobleman is in full armor, full ecclesiastical regalia. Well, Paul Bush, who was the first bishop of Bristol back in the 16th century, thought he would do it a little differently. So he had his effigy made of a half-rotted corpse. And his name is Paul Bush. You can just Google Paul Bush Bristol, and you can see images of it. I'm not joking. And this was kind of one of the whole themes in Christianity. I mean, I talk traditional Christianity, the memento mori. Well, you're going to die. Now, often that was saying, well, you're going to die, you're facing hell, so you better shape up. But a more profound understanding is, you know, I'm not the body, so what am I? And as I think some of you know, some of the great Indian mystics like Sri Ramana Maharshi have said that the question, who am I, is the one that can lead you directly to enlightenment. Because you realize, you know, suddenly you're not all this. You're not your body. You're not your social identity. You're not your identity as dad or mom or loving son or loving daughter. You're not your professional identity. You're not your social status. You go on and on, even though you identify yourself with these things. And if you look at it, you know, quite seriously, you'll start to see that maybe you, and certainly most people, actually have to work hard to maintain this identification. It's actually kind of a job to, you know, keep believing you're this stuff because it's not true. It's not hard to believe the truth. It's always hard to believe a lie. And it's much easier to lie to any number of people than it is to lie to one person, even if that one person happens to be you, which explains a lot about human nature, I think. So the point is to begin at least not by taking this world so seriously. And that leads to forgiveness. Forgiveness is a very vexed issue. And it is kind of along the lines of, I don't know, it's like safety. Everybody agrees safety is important. You have to have safety. You have to, you know. On the other hand, no one kind of really wants to hear very much about it. Because, I don't know, it's just somehow not that interesting or that much fun. And you'll all know, of course, that I would say most people, and including myself, get a certain amount of enjoyment out of my grievances. It's just really fun to be indignant. And, you know, and we live in such a great, beautiful time. This is like a golden age of things to be indignant about. It's like, you know, how could it be better? But notice, you know, you're outraged about all of this, you know, whatever side of the political thing you're on, you're outraged at this side or that side. Your outrage is kind of fun, isn't it? Like, at least a little bit. Think about that. And of course, all of this outrage, then you jump to the conclusion that all of this outrage is disturbingly a present-day form of entertainment. Think about that one. However, as you release this, if you say, well, this is kind of what's going on, but you manage to detach yourself, can you forgive X, Y, and Z person? Well, maybe, maybe not. That's another long topic. But I will say, and my other book is called The Deal, which is a guide to radical and complete forgiveness, and it explores some of this and gives kind of a technique for doing this. And the main reason for it is, even if you set aside all this stuff I've said about A Course in Miracles and so on, and the unreality of the way things are, even viewed in terms of ordinary common sense, your grievances are doing you absolutely no good. I mean, smoking or eating may be fun, but they don't do you any good either. There are things that are fun that are not good for you, as I guess you've all found. And grievances may be one of them. As you know, of course, it's a mistake to imagine that you're being mad at someone else does them any particular harm, at least to any extent that it does to you. I think it was a Buddhist who said, not forgiving someone is like drinking a glass of poison hoping it will kill somebody else. So even apart from all of this metaphysics that I've gone into, there are good reasons for forgiveness. You'll simply feel better. You don't have to go into denial. Yeah, that was a really terrible thing. But I can't hang on to this. I mean, you read about people who've gone through, some of the great atrocities in history, trauma, abuse, whatever. And they seem to fall into two general categories. One is people who are, just broken by it forever. I'm just broken by this horrible thing. And we're not denying that it was a horrible thing. I'm broken by this. And that's it. I am a machine that has to be hauled off to the junkyard. Or the other approach is, yeah, this was really horrible. This was really horrible. On the other hand, I went through it, and I've got a life, and I've got to get through it. And one type of person is extremely weak, and the other is very strong. And yeah, does it all have to do with willpower and just a conscious decision? Yes, it does, but then most everything else does too. That's an extreme version of what I'm talking about. So the idea is that if you just forgive and let this go, you will be released. But didn't I just say that everybody is one person? God has only one son, and it's us. So, when you're released, everyone else is released too, at least a little. Even people you don't know about, people you don't hear about, people who have no idea your existence, your release in some way lightens the load on everyone. And this is a process of cosmic restoration, which the Course calls the Atonement, which again has nothing to do with somebody torturing part of God to death so God feels better about it or something. It's the process of recognizing this illusion and gradually coming together. And when this process is consummated, according to the Course, that is, shall we say, the second coming, the last judgment. But in this last judgment, everybody is off the hook. Nobody is condemned. Because none of what you did happened in any reality. Would you send a man to jail for a crime he committed when he was dreaming? I don't think so. And that is kind of the beauty of the Course. That is kind of where it's moving. And again, you can call it the Atonement, as the Course does. You can call it lots of other things. The Buddhists or the Mahayana Buddhists would call it the liberation of all sentient beings comes to kind of the same thing. Unfortunately, it's not going to take the form of Jesus showing up in a cloud over Dallas and everybody, you know, all the people being raptured up and having their cars crash. Have you ever seen that picture? Dallas Rapture? Oh, you should look it up. It's on the net. It's called Dallas Rapture. It's not his original name, but it's come to me. I actually put it in as an illustration to an article I wrote years ago about apocalypse. It's great. It's great whether you think it's a portrayal of divine truth or the funniest thing you've ever seen, and that, of course, is a matter of your own theological bent. Now, the Course does say that this atonement is happening, and it happened at the start of the moment of the separation. But it does say, you know, it could take millions of years. But your acts of forgiveness can foreshorten this to an almost miraculous degree. You know, you could forgive now, and it would save thousands of years of lessons you might have to learn otherwise. So that's where the miracles come in. So I think it's a very inspiring vision. I think it speaks a lot. As I say, it's consistent if you follow its premises, which no other Christian theology that I've ever encountered is. Do you have to take any of it on faith? Well, only provisionally. I mean, you have to think, well, does this make sense to me? On a conceptual level, does it make sense to me? B, on a practical level, does it work? Does it actually work in my life? And those are the criteria you have to use. Faith is at best a provisional thing in that, okay, I guess I could see this. Let me give it a try. I don't think it's wise to have faith, like to keep doing something that seems like a failure to you, or to believe something that doesn't make sense to you at a deep level. You know, there's a kind of this tirade in certain spiritual circles, like evangelical Christian circles, against what's called supermarket spirituality. You know, the idea being that you can just go to the store and pick the doctrines you want to believe in and just go home with your own little package. And this is said to be a bad thing. But I disagree. I say it is not only your right to do that, it's your duty to do that. It's your duty to pick and choose the things that make sense to you and leave at the store the things that don't. That is your duty to yourself as a human being of integrity. And whether that's the Course or some portion of the Course, that may be the case. It may have nothing to do with anything you want to pursue, but it is an option. And I think even the Course says, this is not really for everyone. These are lessons everybody's going to have to learn, but everyone's going to learn them in their own way. There's no universal theology, because it says a universal theology is impossible. A universal experience is not only possible, but necessary. So there are, many other techniques or practices, approaches may well lead to the same point. This happens to be one of them. I think it's particularly valuable because we need to do something to rescue Christianity from itself and from what it's turned itself into. Because some parts of it have become just incredibly hateful. And unfortunately, this is not a recent development. And some parts of it are nice, but no, we don't actually really believe that. Let me get back to you about what we do believe. I've got to run now. So this may be a way out for Christianity as a theology. It may be something you want to look into personally. It's very likely that some of the things I say will strike home and make sense to you. Some of it may well you just shake your head, and that's all legitimate. That's all part of the whole process. Anyway, I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for listening. There's time for questions and comments.
So how is this theology of love?
Well, it does say that love is the proper response to everything. In fact, the Course says that there are only two basic emotions, love and fear. And if you see someone manifesting fear which includes things like anguish and hatred. And I admit this is a tall order. You're to see it as a call for love. I said it was a tall order. And God has not condemned anybody. The verdict for everyone is unimaginable happiness forever. And it was only our desire to kind of try something else. And so that, is there a hell? Well, you can create one mentally for yourself, but it's not a hell that God created. As you well know, even a little bit of anger or paranoia can make the world seem fairly hellish. So there's no hell, there's no condemnation. This was never God's idea. It was a little experiment we thought we would try. And fortunately, it kind of feels as if we're trapped in it and, we're kind of clawing around for a way out. So I would say that makes it a theology of love. You're forgiven everything. The hitch is that you have to forgive everybody, everything too, and realize that everybody is forgiven. And to say it a third time, it's a tall order, or it can seem to be.
So it always struck me that the theology of Christ was, you shall do all these things and more if you but have the faith of a mustard seed. So could you just speak to that briefly?
Yeah, I didn't really talk too much about Christology, as it's called. And the whole thing is that Jesus is part of the Son of God. He's no more or less part of the Son of God than any of us. His only difference, according to the Course, and this is a point on which I regard personally as open, is that he's the first person to realize the atonement and accept it perfectly. So he's just, as he describes himself in the Course, as an elder brother. And it also says, respect and affection are appropriate for an elder brother. Worship is not. So Jesus himself, so if you have faith, and, since the whole power of the thing is in the, since this is all a mental construct, you can, accomplish miracles. Now, the thing about it is you have to reach that level of consciousness at which you can do that. And it's heavily defended by all these fears and whatnot. You can sometimes, shall we say, as they call it, storm the gates of heaven. You kind of burst your way through in a artificial way, but it might not work so well for you. So if Jesus did X, Y, and Z miracles, I don't say he did and I don't say he didn't, but he, at least theoretically, had no powers that none of us have. And play with it. I mean, pretty much everyone, certainly in the alternative spirituality world, has sort of realized that, the mind is a very, very powerful thing. As Milton said, the mind is its own place, can make a hell of heaven, a heaven of hell. We don't have access to it because of our fragmented, distracted nature.
Could you speak a little bit about the Course in Miracles understanding of the crucifixion and the resurrection? Please. Thank you.
It portrays the crucifixion and the resurrection as an object lesson. And it basically is, again, whether Jesus is saying this or not, I take no particular stance, but Jesus was saying, well, look, I went through all of this, but it really had no effect on me whatsoever. And the point is, And he says, I'm not asking you to go through a crucifixion like this. That was my own special contribution. I'm just saying that you might be a good idea if you take the little trials and tribulations that, grieve you so much and realize they too are insubstantial. So in a sense, it's, do not make the mistake of clinging to the old rugged cross. The only message of the cross is that you can overcome the cross. And what is this cross that we're all crucified on? Time and space. The cross that Jesus was crucified on, ostensibly back in 30 AD, whenever, is, shall we say, a symbol of this. So, as I say, it's more of an object lesson. And I think that echoes in other realms of esoteric Christianity, where, like, for example, in her book entitled Esoteric Christianity, Annie Besant says, well, the crucifixion is a symbol for you yourself go through and are going through. The Son of God comes down to earth, kind of runs around a little bit, makes friends and enemies, and then he dies a painful and humiliating death on a cross called time and space. But actually it doesn't really make any difference because nothing really ultimately real or permanent about him is destroyed. So he comes back in a new and glorified form. And the lesson is not that just happened to one man way back when, but in a sense it happens to all of us. In a sense, happens to all of us almost whether we like it or not, so at least we might as well recognize it and derive some comfort from it. A Course in Miracles is very agnostic about reincarnation. Because, of course, it says, if the body is not real, reincarnation cannot exist. On the other hand, it really does not say you should not believe in reincarnation. It sort of says, the idea is usually helpful. And that's probably because it probably is the case that most of us do go through repeated lives, quite possibly on something very much resembling Earth. The illusion, shall we say, replicates it until you learn the lesson. So, of course, it's not as much against reincarnation as one might think, or as the Christian tradition has always been. Christianity has never been very fond of the idea of the reincarnation, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But anyway, that's some insight.
Do you have any criticisms of the Course? And if so, could you describe them?
Excuse me?
Do you have any criticisms of the Course? Like personally?
Yeah. I guess one is something that didn't really come up in any of this, but it has a very stark contrast between what it calls the special relationship and the holy relationship. Are you familiar with the Course? Do you know much about it, or little? Okay. Well, according to the Course, relationships of the world are basically special. They're alliances of the ego, and they're extremely treacherous. Because you're trying to get something from somebody else who's trying to get something from you. This is called, it's called the special relationship. And it can take the form of anything from a romance to a lifelong enmity. And then it's the holy relationship is a contrast. And the holy relationship is a relationship in which it's completely loving, but in a sense it's also non-exclusive. And the idea is that Christ is the person who embodies the holy relationship. He's sort of, he's not really attached to anybody. If you read the Gospels, even as they are, he's not really attached to anybody. But, he's not even to his family. A couple of parts of the Gospels, he really doesn't even want to be bothered with them, which often understandable. But it's kind of this impersonal love versus this highly personal. I call the special relationship transactional love. And I wrote a book about it, which is here. It's called, this is from the library, so I guess we don't have any for sale here. This is called Conscious Love. And it kind of contrasts what I call transactional love, which is pretty much everything, with conscious love, which is something like what I described, what some of you are familiar with the language of Christianity know as agape, because that's the Greek word for it, what is used in the New Testament. What does it mean? It means what I just said. All that, like, a number of people, even including some close to me, thought this book was actually rather cold and cynical in its evaluation of a transactional love. And so it may have been, but it's not as stark as the Courses. And my whole point as a criticism of the Course, it's like, it's a little bit murkier than this kind of radical special relationship, holy relationship thing. There's a lot back and forth, because a lot in fact, everything in human life is somewhat ambiguous. The Course is a little black and white in that, and in certain other respects. And I don't have an enormous problem with it personally, because, this is an introductory text. This is like, introduction to economics or something. It's putting things in a very, very basic, stark way, just the way you have to do in any, shall we say, introductory course. When you're done with it, let's say you've done all the lessons, well, then it says, well, then it's much more of a personal thing. You can go back and do them again. I know people who go back and start it every year, every January 1st, and go through them again. I personally don't want to do this, but that's their business. But the whole point is that later on, as you kind of get the point, you start to see more and more how to apply it in any specific situation. So it's a mild criticism of the Course, but I suppose you could call it that.
Can you elaborate on the cloud of unknowing that you mentioned earlier?
Well, let's put it this way. You can consider it as a coma that gave rise to the world, a collective coma out of which everything comes. Everything that we know. You could even be, it's the background of just pure separation. The Cloud of Unknowing as a book, says more or less what I said earlier, that as you strive to reach God, you'll kind of reach this cloud, and that's what he simply calls it in the language of the 14th century, and that you can get through it by a meditative practice, which he says involves, you can say, for example, just constantly bring your attention using a single word like God or love. There's a practice that's kind of developed out of this that's become quite popular in recent decades called centering prayer. It's kind of based on that. I have never done centering prayer, but I've known people who've gotten good results from it, and it's basically inspired by a cloud of unknowing.